Welcome to day 218. We are in Jeremiah 19 and 20, and finally in Daniel. So today's kind of an introduction to Daniel, and we're kind of running out of Jeremiah. And the Exodus is the exile is happening. An extremely important part of this. Where finally the rest of the Jews, the Hebrews, the Israelites, whatever you want to call them, are going to be exiled. So let's get at that part of it. And let's read in Jeremiah 19, 4 and 5. So, for Israel has forsaken me and turned this valley into a place of wickedness. Stop right there. The whole point is that God warned them and warned them and warned them from the very beginning, and finally, his patience has run out. They've turned their back on him totally. Even when Jeremiah is giving them his messages, they don't want to hear it. And that sounds a little bit like some people today. They just don't want to know God. They don't want to know anything about God. Even when they're wrong, they don't want to know. They don't want to be held accountable because if they acknowledge God, they have to be held accountable. And that's kind of like what was going back then, but it was all over back then. The people burn incense to foreign gods, idols never before acknowledged by this generation, by their ancestors or by the kings of Judah. And it goes on. It says, this is the important part. And they have filled this place with the blood of innocent children. I think that is a key part in a lot of what has happened in the world. Anytime we start to spill blood of innocent children, bad things in those countries start to happen. Verse 5, they burn their sons as sacrifices to Baal. So, what a horrible, horrible thing to do. And yet, even in our own country today, we murder innocent people. I want to talk about the judgment seat of Christ. I started another list because this list is really kind of important when it comes to Revelation. This list is called the judgment seat of Christ. We don't hear a lot about the judgment seat of Christ. So what I did was I took some of the attributes of God, some of the descriptions of God that had to do with forgiveness and mercy, compassion, and holding us by our right hand, by his hand, him standing up for us, which in Jeremiah 20:11, it says, "But the Lord stands beside me like a great warrior." Okay, that's great. But then the next line says this, "Before him my persecutors will stumble. They cannot defeat me. They will fail and be thoroughly humiliated. Their dishonor will never be forgotten." So I believe this to be a judgment seat of Christ time where we're all guilty. We're going to stand before the judge. We're all guilty. But here's the thing. Who's going to be standing beside us? Standing in front of us, for us? The great warrior, Jesus Christ. And who's accusing us? All these people will be accusing us. The great accuser, Satan, will be accusing us. But Jesus has us by our right hand. He is going to be standing there for us. This, in my opinion, is a judgment seat of Christ moment where we're raptured. Okay, again, real quickly, the church age, then the rapture happens where in a moment, in the blink of an eye, we are taken to heaven. 7 years of tribulation, the greatest punishment on earth ever to happen. The Antichrist rules. Then the second coming. So in the 7 years, where are we at? Well, we're in heaven, and that's what we call the judgment seat of Christ, where we are spending time 7 years in heaven with Christ. Now, don't be afraid. You're in heaven. And you standing at the judgment seat of Christ, the accuser may be accusing you, but you're safe and you're forgiven. You're already there. And the great part about the judgment seat of Christ is we're going to start to see as we get closer and closer to Revelation that we don't have anything to worry about. So don't worry about this judgment seat of Christ. And don't worry about the great white throne of judgment, which is further down the road. We are saved from persecution. We are saved from that time of testing. We are saved from that. That doesn't mean we won't be persecuted here while we're here, but we don't have to worry about the judgment seat of Christ. But I wanted to point that out because that phrase, the judgment seat of Christ, is going to come up again. So I started that list, and the reason I started that list is because Daniel, we get to read Daniel, start it today, and it's going to have a lot of prophetic information about the end times. So, which leads up to the judgment seat, the rapture and the judgment seat of Christ and the Antichrist ruling. Okay, so in Daniel, we're in Daniel 1, and it's the introduction of who Daniel is. And I want to read the first verse. It says, during the 3rd year of King Jehoiakim's reign in Judah, King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon came to Jerusalem and besieged it. The Lord gave him victory over King Jehoiakim of Judah and permitted him to take some of the sacred objects from the temple of God. So Nebuchadnezzar took them back to the land of Babylon. Okay, so what's important about this is, if you look at the timeline, and this is why it's important to keep a timeline, there's about 70 years, amazingly, 70 years, we've been talking about 70 years, from the time that the last of the people in Jerusalem and Judah finally get taken into Babylon and into exile, to the point where the next king that we've talked about, not necessarily the next king, but the king in that area allows the first exiles to return. Okay, and we talked about Nehemiah, and we read in Ezekiel, which we're going to read in that stuff again. We haven't read that yet. We're going to get into that. So that's why this is important. This kicks off that 70-year period. Verse 6, it talks about Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, and their names being changed to the famous names that we all know: Belteshazzar, Meshach, Abednego, and Shadrach. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And we're going to read about Daniel being thrown into the lion's den and all this stuff. So, but what's amazing is Daniel's alive during the 70-year period. And he gets to see all this stuff, and God uses him while everybody's in exile to talk about the major prophecies of the world. It's an amazing thing, and God gives them special abilities. Verse 17, we're going to end with this, which is important to note. So this gets added to my witchcraft, mediums, and psychics, sorcerers, enchanters list that I have. But what's important is he gives them special ability. 17, God gave these 4 young men an unusual aptitude for understanding every aspect of literature and wisdom. And God gave Daniel the special ability to interpret the meanings of visions and dreams. Verse 20, whenever the king consulted them in any matter requiring wisdom and balanced judgment, he found them 10 times more capable than any of the magicians and enchanters in his entire kingdom. So I added that to my enchanters, magicians, witchcraft, mediums, and psychics list, just to show that it's ridiculous. Not that there aren't those people, not that they don't have some weird knowledge. It's just that they're not as good. It's not proper, and God says not to use them. It's just ridiculous. Why bother? So the abilities that God gives them, that's the key part. And that's where Daniel becomes a wealth of information. What I want from you from this point on, whenever we read Daniel, I want you to spend extreme amount of time poring over what they're saying. I will try to make sure we're understanding the key points and try to explain what they are. Most of the stuff's really pretty simple. So please spend that time, because it's necessary when we get to Revelation that will all start to make sense when you read it, as long as we put forth the effort now. That's your day 218. I'll see you tomorrow.